Very good evening. We welcome all the seniors, friends, and the participants on behalf of our team Legal Speak webinar. Mr. We also sincerely welcome Mr. G. Karthikeyan from New Delhi, who is going to give presentation on today's topic of prevention of money laundering act 2002 with some critical analysis. He enrolled as an advocate in Chennai only in the year 2017. Initially, he started his career as junior with former additional advocate General Mr. Manishankar. After 2 years practicing with him, he shifted to New Delhi and continued his practice as associate with Augusta Legal LLP New Delhi. Now he had got experience and being specialized is a special subject for dealing with the white collar criminals. We sincerely wish him all success as on behalf of our legal team speak webinars for his bright future and his career. Over to Mr. J. Karthikeyan. All the best. Best wishes.
Thank you, Munimanan sir, for the modest introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm extremely humbled to be here, sharing this platform with each and every one of you. I understand presently we're all going through some very difficult times, challenging times, I should say. Despite that, you've taken your time and come to listen to me. I find this extremely motivating. It's extremely encouraging. Thank you for that. I also specifically record my thanks to Jayachandran sir and his team for putting all this together and making this happen. So with that, let's talk about money laundering, shall we? Money laundering, this term has become very famous these days. So popular that there are movies made about it. There are series, sitcoms on Netflix and whatnot. In fact, there are even videos on YouTube which will show you how to launder your money. Can you believe that? If you ask a legal expert what money laundering is, he would say it's an organized crime. But what does he mean by that? Let's find out, shall we? Let's take the example of art industry, the modern art, the contemporary art. There was something about this art industry that never made any sense to me until very recently. Because I couldn't understand what is so special about it. There are some people who are willing to purchase those modern art and contemporary art by paying millions and millions of dollars, euros, and Indian currency. I mean, have you seen those modern art and modern paintings? It's just a splash of color on a piece of paper and a canvas. A 5-year-old kid can do that. I can do that. And I can call myself an artist. But the question is, what is so special about these modern art that people are so, crazy about it? People are willing to pay a fortune. If you ask these people why they buy the modern art, why they buy it, they'll say art is beauty. And beauty is priceless. Beauty lies in the eyes of beholder. They give all kinds of reasons. But let's be honest, shall we? Are they the actual reasons why they buy it? Let me give you an alternate perspective as to why some people buy this modern art. And I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, it has nothing to do with, art, beauty, and appreciation, because there is more to it than what it meets the eye. Let me give you an example so that, I can put all this in perspective. Let's take one Mr. Kumar. Okay, Mr. Kumar is is involved in a lot of illegal activities. And as a result of those illegal activities, Mr. Kumar has earned a lot of illegal money, right? Now, Mr. Kumar has to find a way to convert all that illegal money into legal money, because he can't obviously show those illegal money in his income tax returns, right? He'll get caught. So he has to find a way. So Mr. Kumar involves in a process called money laundering. Okay, money laundering essentially means converting your illegal money into legal money. How does Mr. Kumar do it? That's the $1 million question, right? He does it in 2 stages. In the first stage, Mr. Kumar calls one Mr. Prashant, an imaginary person. Mr. Prashant, on the other hand, is a leading expert in the art industry. Okay, Mr. Prashant is a very famous personality, is very popular, so popular that people are willing to buy his paintings, modern arts, for lakhs and crores of rupees. So Mr. Kumar calls Mr. Prashant and says, "Look, Mr. Prashant, I want to buy a modern art. Do you have any?" Mr. Prashant says, "Okay, I do have one. Are you interested?" So Mr. Kumar comes to Mr. Prashant's art gallery and he gets impressed by a modern art, and he offers 10 crore rupees to buy that painting. Okay, let's stop here because this is where the magic happens. Ladies and gentlemen, this transaction, the modern art that is sold for 10 crore rupees, takes place in a private manner, meaning the identity of the seller, the identity of the buyer, the identity of the transaction, everything is kept a secret. The outside world does not know about it. All right. And Mr. Kumar buys this modern art using his illegal money. So specifically illegal cash, because cash does not leave a paper trail, right? So Mr. Kumar purchases this painting by using his illegal cash of 10 crores. This is the first stage. Here, if you notice, the money laundering is not yet complete because Mr. Kumar has spent 10 crore of illegal money, has to get that illegal money back, right? So this is where stage 2 begins. In stage 2, Mr. Kumar takes this painting, he goes to a bank and he applies for a loan of 10 crores. Okay. Now the bank will obviously ask for a security because, no loan can be sanctioned without a security or a collateral, right? Mr. Kumar says, "Okay, I have this painting, a modern art, which is valued at 10 crores. You can keep this as a collateral and sanction me the loan." Now the bank won't obviously take Mr. Kumar's words for granted, right? They have to conduct their own independent evaluation and due diligence to find out what exactly is the value of the painting. So this is where the bank, contacts the leading expert in the art industry, who's none other than Mr. Prashant himself. Now Mr. Prashant confirms, yes, the value of this painting is 10 crores, and I remember selling this painting for 10 crores, and the bank accepts it. The bank takes Mr. Kumar's words for it, Mr. Prashant's words for it, and they sanction the 10 crore money. Now, once that 10 crore money is sanctioned from the bank, Mr. Kumar now has 10 crore rupees clean cash because it's coming from the bank. Mr. Kumar happily takes that 10 crore rupees back home and gives that painting as a collateral to the bank, and the bank now has a modern art painting. Next day, Mr. Kumar defaults on his payments. The bank seizes that painting, but Mr. Kumar now has 10 crore rupees in his hand, clean money. And this is a classic example, ladies and gentlemen, how money laundering takes place. I specifically chose the art industry because earlier art industry used to, operate as a separate system in itself, outside the normal economy. There are various other examples also. In fact, casino, you might have heard about it, casinos, which are very popular in Goa. They are known for money laundering businesses. Then you have the real estate sector. It's a booming industry for money laundering. Then you have the modern day cryptocurrencies, digital currencies, they call it bitcoins. You must have heard about it. In fact, there was a recent Supreme Court judgment about cryptocurrencies, I think last month, it came out last month, where the Honorable Supreme Court lifted the prohibition that was imposed on cryptocurrencies by the RBI. In fact, I was present in the Supreme Court when the last stages of that argument was taking place. And it was argued by senior advocate Shyam Diwan that cryptocurrencies are used in money laundering processes because of their, secret and anonymous character. So his arguments were very informative. So that is another instance of how money laundering takes place. That apart, ladies and gentlemen, these are some of the harmless examples of money laundering business. But there is another side to money laundering, a very ugly side, a deadly side. And I make no bones about it when I say this. Money laundering is used by terrorist outfits across the world to fund their terrorist operations. So we are looking at a threat to the national security. And money laundering is basically corruption. It not only affects the moral fabric of a society, it can cripple the economy, the whole economy. And at the end of the day, it's people like you and me, the middle class group, common taxpayers, who faces the heat and takes the brunt. And money laundering is also peculiar in some ways because it affects everybody. Rich or poor doesn't matter. Everybody is affected. But the poor suffers the most. So with this factual backdrop, ladies and gentlemen, let me start with the topic that is given to me. Okay, PMLA 2002, a critical analysis. I'm sharing my screen. I hope it is visible.
Yes, visible. You can
Okay.
continue.
Okay, let me start with my presentation today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going into each and every provision, explaining to you what the provision means, what is the scope of the provision, what is the habit of the provision and all that, because I don't think it's appropriate for me to do it. Instead, what I'll be doing is, I'll give you a broad understanding of how this PMLA Act is structured. Okay, how it operates, what is the framework of the Act. Then I'll pick some 5 to 6 issues. I'll talk about it in detail. And I assure you, these are 5, 6 issues which will be faced by any legal practitioner or any advocate when he takes a case of money laundering. So that, by the end of today's webinar, we'll have some practical takeaways, not just some theoretical or bookish knowledge. Starting with the first thing, what is the structure of the PMLA? What is the framework of PMLA? How it operates? Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about PMLA, the first and foremost concept that we need to know or we need to understand is the concept of scheduled offense. What is a scheduled offense? If you take the Bar Act of PMLA, the last portion of it contains something called a schedule. Okay, this schedule is in turn divided into 3 parts: Part A, Part B, and Part C. Part A in turn contains some 30 paragraphs to it. Okay, for example, the paragraph number 1 talks about IPC, Indian Penal Code. Okay, let me bring that schedule up so that everybody can understand with clarity. This is the schedule. I hope it's visible on the screen. So, Mudimanan sir, you
Not
please.
yet. Not yet.
Okay.
We are unable to view. Only schedule offense, predicate offense, only it is there. The schedule is not visible.
How about now, sir? Is it fine?
Now it is. Offenses
Okay.
under in IPC.
Yes. This is schedule. This is the schedule of PMLA. It starts with Part A. Okay. In Part A, the paragraph number 1 deals with IPC. Okay. IPC, there are some IPC offenses listed here, starting from 120B and all the way it goes to 489B. Then in paragraph 2, you have the NDPS of substances, NDPS Act. So the idea is, ladies and gentlemen, only when any of these offenses here contained in the schedule is committed, only then PMLA will come into the picture, not before that. Because PMLA is something called a predicate offense, meaning it is predicated or it is dependent or it's a component of another offense. Understood? So the scheduled offense, this is the schedule. If any of the offense contained in the schedule is committed, then PMLA come into the picture. This is one thing that we need to understand. Okay. The next thing is ECIR versus FIR. We all know what FIR is. First information report. A police officer will file an FIR under 154 of CRPC when a cognizable offense is committed. Similar to that, there is a concept called ECIR in PMLA Act. Okay, ECIR stands for Enforcement Case Information Report. Okay, ECIR is very similar to FIR, but it's not the same. But there is one connection. ECIR gets filed only after FIR. Okay, let me give you an example so that I can convey the point. Say there is a public servant. Okay, now this public servant commits an offense of taking bribe. He takes a bribe. Taking bribe, as we all know, is punishable under Prevention of Corruption Act. Okay, now this public servant will first be investigated for the offense of Prevention of Corruption Act by the CBI. CBI will file a FIR or RC, that's what they call. They'll file an FIR and they start their investigation from the corruption angle. But there is another angle to it, the money laundering angle. The second question to be seen is whether that public servant has converted this illegal money, bribe, into legal money, whether he has done that. That should be investigated. That will be investigated by the Enforcement Directorate authorities. Okay, they'll start their investigation by filing something called ECIR. So FIR, police investigation, ECIR, ED investigation. That's how it works. Now, when ECIR is filed, okay, the ED investigation starts. The ED authorities will first go after the property or the money that is involved. Okay, so the civil proceedings will start first. Understand? So what happens is, in the civil proceedings, they pass something called provisional attachment order. Okay, it's called PAO or provisional attachment order. This provisional attachment order is very much similar to an attachment order, like a freezing order. Okay, it will be passed by the enforcement directorate authorities themselves. Like it could be the director or the joint director or the assistant director or the deputy director. These ED authorities will pass a PAO or provisional attachment order. This provisional attachment order is like a preliminary order. Okay. This provisional attachment order now has to be confirmed by another authority. Okay, that authority is called adjudicating authority. This adjudicating authority comes under section 8 of PMLA. So once this provisional attachment order is confirmed by that adjudicating authority, the next stage is you can take that to an appeal before a tribunal. So this is the civil proceedings. In fact, I'll show you a diagram that picturizes everything. Here, if you see, once an ECIR is filed, the civil process will begin by a provisional attachment order. This provisional attachment order will be passed by the ED authorities themselves. And after this provisional attachment order is passed, it has to be confirmed by AA or the adjudicating authority. It is done under section 8 of PMLA. Once that is done, then you can go before a tribunal for an appeal. Okay, and the last stage, ladies and gentlemen, is called the confiscation stage, which will not happen immediately. Okay, it will take time. It will come only after a special court passes an order. Okay, this is special court is nothing but a criminal court which will take care of the criminal proceedings. Now let's start with the main provision of PMLA, which is nothing but proceeds of crime and how it interacts with section 3 of PMLA. Okay, let's start with section 3 first, then we'll come to the understanding of what proceeds of crime is. See, this is the definition of section 3. This is what the legislation says. Section 3 defines the offense of money laundering. It says, whosoever directly or indirectly attempts to indulge or knowingly assist or knowingly is a party or is actually involved in any process or activity. Ladies and gentlemen, if you read the first two lines, you can understand how broad and how wide the provision is. Please look at the words, whosoever, directly or indirectly. So it is worded in the most widest way possible. But if you read the last two lines, you can see there is a twin conditions that is imposed. The first is there should be a proceeds of crime. That's the first condition. And the second condition is this proceeds of crime should be projected or claimed as an untainted property. Okay, untainted property meaning clean property. So in order to invoke section 3, I need to satisfy two conditions. The first condition is I must have a proceeds of crime. And the second condition is that proceeds of crime must be projected or claimed as an untainted property. Only when I satisfy these two conditions, I can invoke section 3 of PMLA. Only then the offense of money laundering is completed. All right. Now, okay, let me give you an example so that we can understand this twin conditions. Okay. For example, let's say there is a public servant. Public servant is sitting in his office. On his office table, there is 10 lakh rupees that is lying. Okay, 10 lakh rupees that bribe money that is lying on the table. Now, a ED officer walks in. The ED officer asks, what is this money? Now, the public servant says, this is a bribe money. Now, the question is, ladies and gentlemen, whether the offense of money laundering is committed or not. The answer is no, because the second condition is not satisfied. Okay, we know that bribe amount is proceeds of crime. All right, perfect. The first condition is satisfied. But the second condition, that is, this bribe amount is not projected or claimed as an untainted property. The public servant accepts that this is a bribe amount. He's not claiming or is not, projecting to the world that it's clean money. He's accepting it. Now, let's rewind. Let's go back. The ED officer walks in. He finds 10 lakh rupees on the table. He's asking the public servant, what is this money? But this time the public servant says, this is my salary. Now he has committed an offense of money laundering, because now by saying that bribe money is salary, the public servant is projecting or claiming to the world that it's an untainted money, and that thereby those two conditions that are given under section 3 are satisfied, hence money laundering offense is committed. So ladies and gentlemen, unless we understand this twin condition here, we can't proceed further, because from here it gets really technical. So let's recap quickly. To invoke section 3, I need to satisfy two things. I need to show there is something called proceeds of crime, and two, I need to show that this proceeds of crime is projected or claimed as an untainted property. Only when I do these two, section 3 can be invoked. All right. Now, let's come to what proceeds of crime is. I've been talking about proceeds of crime, proceeds of crime, proceeds of crime all this while. Let's see how the statute defines proceeds of crime. If you take section 2U of PMLA, it says any property derived or obtained directly or indirectly by any person as a result of criminal activity. This is the definition of proceeds of crime. Okay, if you take the key words here are that any property derived or obtained. Okay, let's be very careful with the words that are used here. The provision says the property must be derived or obtained from a criminal offense. So it must be a byproduct. The provision does not say property must be involved in an offense. There is a difference. Okay, there is a difference between two statements. The first statement is property obtained or derived from an offense. The second statement is property involved in an offense. These are two different things. There is a clear distinction between these two statements. But in order to satisfy section 2U, I need to show that the property is derived or obtained as a byproduct from the criminal activity. That is the mandate of this section. Let me give you an example so that you can understand the scope of this provision. Okay, the first case law that I'm going to rely today is the case of HEPL versus Union of India. This is a single judgment passed by the Delhi High Court. The facts of the case are this. Here what happens is CBI files an FIR against this company called HEPL. Okay, under section 420 read with 120B of IPC against the company as well as the company's directors. The allegation is that this company has misrepresented a status of a land or committed the act of cheating and purchased the land. Okay. Now, after the purchase of the land, this company invested some money or made some investment into another company called GPL. Now, this GPL company is involved in the mining operation on this particular land. Let me show it in a diagram or pictorial representation so that we can all understand. This HEPL commits an offense of 420, which is cheating, and purchases this coal block here. They commit 420 and purchase this coal block here. Now, after that, they make an investment into another company called GPL, which is a separate transaction, which has nothing to do with the previous transaction. It's a separate transaction. This investment that is made into the company called GPL, this company later, starts an operation on this coal block, this illegal land. So the ED authorities, what they did was, they attached this land and they also attached the investment that is made by this company HEPL onto this company GPL. So this was naturally challenged before the Delhi High Court. In the Delhi High Court, the Enforcement Directorate argued, look, this land is obtained by committing cheating, which is a punishable offense under 420 IPC, which is also a scheduled offense. So investigation under money laundering can start. Then this investment is made into this company so that this company can act on this particular land, this illegal land. So there is a connection, there is an involvement of this transaction, the investment that is made in the form of shares. But the Delhi High Court says, look, please read the provision carefully. The provision says property derived or obtained from a commission of an offense. The provision does not say property that is involved in a criminal activity. No, these are two separate things. So you cannot attach this particular investment. This particular investment is coming from a clean source. There is no allegation that this particular investment is coming from any criminal activity. So you cannot attach this. You can attach this properly, this whole block maybe, but you cannot attach this investment that is made. So the Delhi High Court has categorically held property involved in a criminal activity is different from property derived or obtained from criminal activity. These are two separate things. This is one thing that we need to remember. Let's be very clear about this because this will be repeated again and again in the slides. Now let's take another illustration. In this, what happens is there is a group in Chennai. This group is involved in textile business. So this group purchases a piece of land from a wife. The wife is a seller. They want to expand their business in the textile industry. They want to start, constructing a new shopping complex. So they purchase a land from the wife. Later, they came to know that the husband of the wife is involved in various FIR or various criminal offenses. There are multiple FIRs against him. There are allegations that this person has earned a lot of illegal money, is involved in a lot of illegal wealth. There is also an allegation that using this illegal money, he has purchased the property in question. So ED comes into picture. ED says, look, the property that you purchased is purchased using illegal money, so we are attaching it. They attach it. Now the matter goes before the tribunal. Before the tribunal, this was argued. There were two arguments before the tribunal. The group said, look, we don't know anything about the criminal history of this property because we got this from the seller wife. We have, we are completely clueless about the criminal antecedent or the criminal history of this property. We don't know whether the husband was involved in any particular crime or not. How could we know? Okay. Then, the enforcement directorate then put a counter argument by saying, look, you should have conducted some kind of a background check before purchasing this property. Then you could have known whether this property was involved in some kind of, illegal activities or not. But that's not very practical, right? If at all, if I want to purchase a property, I can at best get an information whether the property is involved in any litigation. I won't know whether the owner of the property has committed any crime. That information is not available in the general public. So this is first information. We didn't know, first argument, we didn't know that the property was involved in any criminal activity. The second argument was, if at all you want to attach something, go and attach this sale consideration, the 6 crore rupees that was paid to purchase this property. This sale consideration is lying in the bank account of the wife, lying there simply. You attach that. Why are you coming after the property? This argument was well received by the tribunal, and the tribunal was, convinced. Okay, why not? The ED authorities go after the sale consideration. Why are they coming after the property? And a favorable order was passed. The property was later released from the attachment process. Let me come to another illustration. Okay, this illustration will test your understanding of proceeds of crime, whether you have actually understood the concept of proceeds of crime. Here, what happens is, there is an airline company. Okay, this airline company comes into the business in the year 2014. When they come into business, they want to operate both in the domestic field as well as on the international level, meaning they wanted to fly both domestic flights as well as international flights. But if you remember, back in 2014, there was this rule called 5/8/20 rule, which means you need to have 5 years of experience and 20 aeroplanes in your commercial fleet. Only then you can operate on an international level. That was the rule back then. So there was an allegation against this airline company that they paid some bribes to senior level IAS officers to get this rule removed, to remove this 5/20 rule. So ED now starts investigation, but now the question is, what is the proceeds of crime here? We know, as far as the IAS officers are concerned, the proceeds of crime are the alleged bribes. But what is the proceeds of crime earned by this company, the airline company? What is the proceeds of crime taken by this airline company? This is the tricky question, right? Can you say this 5/20 rule is the proceeds of crime? Well, technically, yes, because that is a result of a criminal activity. So it should be a proceeds of crime. But now the question is, what will you attach? Will you attach a rule which is no more in place? You can attach bribes, okay, but what will you attach from the company? So this is where the second question comes in. Can the profits that were made by the company from the year 2014 till 2020, can they be attached? Because only because this rule was removed, this company could operate on an international level and make profits from international flights. So it's a logical argument to say the profits that were earned from the company from 2014 till date should be attached. That's a logical argument, right? But let's see what the court has to say. In order to answer this question, I'm going to rely on a case law called the Ahsan Ali case. Okay, it's a bail application that started first in the Bombay High Court. Okay, then it was appealed before the Supreme Court. Bombay High Court passed an order granting bail. Then it was appealed before the Supreme Court, and the bail was denied. Okay, this Ahsan Ali, this person is an international arms dealer. Okay, he's a very interesting person. You should read about him. He's living a very interesting life. The basic facts of this case is, this Ahsan Ali has created a lot of fake passports, which is an offense under Passports Act. After creating all these fake passports, he goes to a foreign country, he opens a bank account in that foreign country, and he deposits some money into that bank account. Now the ED wants to attach that money that is deposited in the foreign bank account. Okay. So the argument that was made before the court is this. This was the argument. I normally don't put big paragraphs on slides, but this time I'm compelled to do it because this whole paragraph pretty much summarizes the point that I want to make. It was argued by the state. It was argued by... Hello? Hello, sir. Okay, I think that's...
You can continue. There is some disturbance. You can continue.
Okay. See, this was the argument that was raised by the state. And the state said, look, this person, Ahsan Ali, has gone out of India using fake passport. And using that fake passport, he opened a bank account. Thus, by committing an offense under the Passport Act, the appellant could go out of India, and that he could go out of India, he could open an account in a foreign bank. Therefore, the money that was credited into that account would be property derived or obtained as a result of criminal activity. You understand the argument that they are making. They are saying, this person created fake passports. This creation of fake passports is an offense under Passport Act. Because of him committing this offense, he could go out of the country and he could open that bank account. This was only made possible because he committed an offense under Passports Act. So they are saying whatever money that was later deposited in the bank account should be property derived or obtained as a result of criminal activity. This was the argument that was made by the state before the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court said, no, this is a very far-fetched argument. Even accepting that this argument is true, that opening of a bank account may be considered as an illegal activity or a result of an illegal activity, but it does not mean the money that is deposited in the bank account automatically becomes illegal. To know whether the money is illegal or not, you need to go and trace the source or the origin of the money. You need to see from where the money is coming. If it's coming from a clean source or it's coming from a criminal activity, that you should find out, because that's a separate transaction. So the Supreme Court said, this money that is lying in the foreign bank account cannot be attached because it's not a property that is obtained or derived from an offense. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if we apply this logic to the airline industry or the airline company case, we know that getting an international permit, removing that 5/20 rule and starting an international operation may be a result of a criminal activity. But it does not mean whatever profits that was earned by the company by flying the international flights automatically become illegal. No. You need to find out from where that money came in. That money came from the market by selling the flight tickets. People like you and me purchase those flight tickets. So it's coming from a clean source. So even in that case, the profits that were made by the airline company from 2014 till 2020 cannot be attached. That's one thing. Now, okay, this is another interesting thing that has happened recently. Uh, the central government came out with something called Finance Act 2019. We all know what Finance Act is, right? Every year, the Parliament passes a Finance Act to amend or modify certain financial laws in the country. It so happened that this time, even the PMLA provisions were amended. There were many amendments, but the amendment that was made to Section 3 was severely criticized. Because what happened was, in Section 3, an explanation was added. This explanation was directly in conflict with the main provision. I'll show you what I mean. In the left-hand side, you can find the main provision, that is Section 3. This we saw already in the preceding slides, where I said Section 3 must satisfy two conditions. One, there should be proceeds of crime. Then there should be something called, then the proceeds of crime must be claimed or projected as an untainted property. If you see the word "and" is used here, this is very important. By the amendment in the Finance Act 2019, an explanation was added here next to this main provision. But the explanation completely, changes the meaning of the main provision itself. This explanation says, if you just have proceeds of crime, that is punishable. You don't have to project or claim that proceeds of crime as an illegal money. You simply have to possess proceeds of crime. That is punishable. But if you notice, the main provision says one thing. Main provision says you need to have two conditions, but the explanation says you don't need to have two conditions. So there is a conflict between the main provision and the explanation. So this has been interpreted by courts. This has been, taken up by the courts in various cases. The courts themselves are a little confused. What exactly is the position? But if you ask my opinion, I would say an explanation cannot overturn the main provision. Explanation does not have the power to overturn the main provision. So we need to go by the main provision. And if you go by the main provision, the twin condition still remains. You need to satisfy two conditions to invoke Section 3 of PMLA. Now coming to another issue. This is a very interesting issue. The question is whether the offense of money laundering is a cognizable or a non-cognizable offense. In fact, this issue started way back in 2005 itself, and it continues even till date. In order to understand why this issue started, we need to go back to 2005 and see what happened then. Back in 2005, Section 45 of PMLA was completely different. Okay, if you see on the left-hand side, this was a provision at the beginning in 2005. If you see, Section 45 heading says offenses to be cognizable and non-bailable. And 45(1)(a) says every person punishable under this act shall be cognizable. It should be every offense punishable under this act should be cognizable. But reading the heading and Section 45(1)(a), we can be sure that this PMLA offense was initially intended to be cognizable offense, because the statute is very clear. But then there was an amendment that took place in 2005. This amendment, what it did, ladies and gentlemen, it removed this provision here, 45(1)(a). It completely removed. And in the right-hand side, you can see the latest provision, what we have today. If you compare these two from left and right, you can see this 45(1)(a) is completely removed. This particular provision, 45(1)(a), is not here. So we need to know why this provision was removed. So to understand this, we need to go back to the Lok Sabha debates that took place. This is the finance minister's speech, which took place in the Lok Sabha when he introduced that particular amendment, 2005 amendment. While introducing this amendment, the finance minister said, this is exactly, these are his words. He said, Section 45(1)(a) is being omitted because the offense is, if the offense is cognizable, then any police officer in this country can arrest without a warrant. But Section 19 says only the director or the assistant director should investigate the offense. So there is a conflict. Therefore, we are making it non-cognizable. Ladies and gentlemen, from this paragraph, we can clearly understand the intention of the legislature is to make the PMLA offense non-cognizable by way of the 2005 amendment. Okay, but what happened was, Here, they removed 45(1)(a), perfect, but they failed to amend the heading of the provision. The heading still says offenses to be cognizable and non-cognizable, non-bailable, but the substance of the provision says PMLA offense is a non-cognizable offense. So now we are stuck in a very precarious situation. The heading says it's a cognizable offense, but the main provision says it's a non-cognizable offense. So there is a clear conflict. And in fact, the courts themselves are very confused with this aspect. The courts, there are divergent views taken by courts, Delhi High Court especially. In one judgment, Delhi High Court says, no, the offense of the PMLA is a cognizable offense. Then there is another judgment by the same Delhi High Court which says, no, PMLA is a non-cognizable offense. So even till date, ladies and gentlemen, this matter is still, that there are still conflicting views taken by the courts, and this matter is still unsettled. So the jury is still out, but in fact there is a full bench of Delhi High Court that is currently taken notice of this matter, 3-judge bench. In the case of Raj Bhushan Om Prakash versus Union of India, the Delhi High Court, a 3-judge bench of Delhi High Court has currently taken over this matter, and they are, I think the hearing in this matter has started. So the judgment may be pronounced anytime now. Only after that judgment is pronounced, we can know for sure whether PMLA offense is a cognizable offense or a non-cognizable offense. But yeah. Now coming to the next aspect, the arrest. Ladies and gentlemen, as we know, the power of arrest depends upon the nature of the offense itself. Whether if the offense is cognizable, then the police officer can perform an arrest without, getting a warrant or without getting a permission from the magistrate, because CRPC allows him to do that. In case of non-cognizable offense, the police officer needs permission or, he needs a warrant from the magistrate to perform arrest. So to understand how arrest operates under PMLA, we need to first understand whether PMLA is a cognizable offense or a non-cognizable offense. But that question again is unsettled. So we don't know how arrest is exactly made in PMLA. But the general practice is in the ED authorities, they arrest a person without a warrant, which means they're following the cognizable offense procedure. But there is another angle to arrest that I want to discuss today. The angle of the procedural safeguards. What are the procedural safeguards that are contained in PMLA Act? And I want to compare this procedural safeguards with the CRPC provisions and see how they differ. Ladies and gentlemen, we know when it comes to cognizable offenses, the main provisions that deal with arrest are section 41, 41A, 50, 57 and 167 of CRPC. In fact, these 5 provisions are the main provisions. There are also other provisions, but these are the 5 main provisions dealing with arrest in cognizable offenses. In fact, there is a connection between these provisions. 41 and 41A will go hand in hand. 57 and 167 will go hand in hand. Section 50 operates as a bridge that connects all these provisions. Let's first see what 41 has to say. Okay. Let me bring the CRPC here. I hope CRPC is visible. Section 41 is visible. See, 41 of CRPC says when a police officer may perform an action of arrest. Here, the police officer I'm so sorry. Yes, police officer can can perform an arrest without a warrant when there is a reasonable complaint or a reasonable suspicion whether a cognizable offense is committed. So this is the first thing. And these are the conditions, the one that I've highlighted here. These are the various conditions or the various circumstances in which a police officer can perform an arrest without a warrant. Now this is very clear. CRPC is very clear. But now coming to the provision of arrest in PMLA. The PMLA also says the deputy director, director or assistant director can arrest a person without a warrant. Okay, if you notice, there are some similarities between section 19 and section 41, such as section 41 uses the word reasonable suspicion, whereas section 19 also uses a somewhat a same similar word. It uses the word reasons to believe. So CRPC says reasons to suspect, PMLA says reasons to believe, which is one similarity. Then if you note here, police officer may arrest without a warrant. Here also you can find the very same thing. ED officers may arrest without a warrant. But there is the last sentence here. This is where the difference takes place. PMLA says the ED authorities as soon as may be inform the person of the grounds of arrest after making the arrest. But if you take CRPC, CRPC says in section 50, let me bring section 50 up. Section 50 says every police officer arresting a person without a warrant shall forthwith communicate. So CRPC says the grounds of arrest must be communicated forthwith, meaning immediately. But PMLA says the grounds of arrest may be informed as soon as may be, which is not immediate. It can be now, or it can be tomorrow, or it can be day after, anytime. There is a discretion that is given to the ED authorities. This is one problem. The second thing is CRPC says the grounds of arrest must be communicated, but PMLA says it has to be informed. There is a difference between the word communicate and the word inform. Communication is a two-way process, meaning the other party is made to understand what I'm saying. But informing means just passing the information to the other party. Whether that party understands or not, that's irrelevant. So there is a qualitative difference between communication and informing. So that these are the two differences between the safeguards that are given under CRPC and the safeguards that are given under section 19. So because of these two words, ladies and gentlemen, as soon as may be and inform, ED authorities are, they have found this loophole, and in many cases they conduct arrest without even, informing the person why he is arrested. He is kept in illegal custody for days together without knowing why he's been arrested and all that. In fact, if you want to read more about this judgment, you can refer to the judgment of Moin Akhtar Qureshi versus Union of India. Here I've put that on my slide. This judgment talks in detail about the arrest that is conducted by the ED authorities. But the problem is the ratio that is given in this judgment is doubted. Okay, this is being challenged in a Rajbhushan case, which is a full bench judgment of the full bench case of the Delhi High Court. So only when the Delhi High Court comes out with this Rajbhushan case, we can completely understand what is the nature of section 19 as well. Till that, jury is still out. Only time can answer. Now coming to the aspect of bail. See, an hardcore criminal practitioner will agree with me when I say bail is one of the most diciest, one of the most nebulous areas in criminal law. Because today the court might say bail can be granted in these sets of cases, in these considerations. Tomorrow the very court will say, no, these kinds of cases don't deserve bail. The worst problem is both these judgments will operate or occupy the field of law without overturning each other. So as a lawyer, we'll be stuck in a very precarious situation to find out which judgment to follow. And I don't even blame courts also, because bail, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, it's all about the facts and circumstances of the cases, right? If the facts vary, so does the consideration before the court. But there are some broad factors or the broad considerations that the court must take into account while granting bail. These are the 6 broad factors that the court must bear in mind while granting bail. This list is not exhaustive. This list is not fully complete. There can be other considerations as well, depending upon the case and circumstances of that particular case. But as far as section 45 of PMLA is concerned, 45 says, apart from these 6 considerations, there should be 2 extra considerations, which are the public prosecutor must be given an opportunity to oppose bail and reasonable ground to believe that the person is guilty of such an offense. Now, there is one problem or one issue with section 45. There is a confusion whether these 2 conditions apply or not. That is the confusion, whether these 2 conditions they apply or not. In order to understand why this confusion started, we need to go back to an amendment that took place in 2012. In 2012, what happened was, if you remember, we saw the schedule of PMLA, right? Part A, Part B, and Part C. Part A had offenses like back in 2012. Part A was completely different. It had offenses like waging war, attempt to wage war, NDPS offenses, terrorism relating offenses, all that. So Part A back then was completely different. It had the most serious crimes, the most heinous crimes. Part B, on the other hand, it had offenses like theft, robbery, cheating, extortion, all the minor offenses. But Part B had one problem. The problem being there was a monetary threshold of 30 lakhs that was kept on Part B. Meaning, if only when I commit a theft of 30 lakhs, then PMLA will come into the picture, not before that. If I commit a theft of say 15 lakhs or 20 lakhs, then PMLA will not come into the picture. So obviously this was a problem, this was a genuine concern. So legislature wanted to get rid of this problem. So what they did was, they transferred all the offenses under Part B into Part A. So now the Part A contains not only offenses regarding terrorism, waging war, etc. It also contains offenses like theft, robbery, and other normal IPC offenses. So Part A now has lost its significance. It has become just another provision, another schedule. But the problem was, the legislature did not amend the main provision itself. The main provision still says, this is the main provision. On the left hand side, you can find the main provision back in 2012. This was the main provision. The main provision says, no person accused of an offense punishable for a term of imprisonment more than 3 years under Part A shall be released on bail. Now, after the amendment, this Part A has lost its significance. There is nothing so special about Part A. If a person commits a terrorism-related offense, he has to go through these two conditions to get bail. Even if a person commits a theft also, he has to go through these two provisions. So it's arbitrary. It was manifestly arbitrary. So the Supreme Court, in the case of Nikhilesh Tarachand versus Union of India, has struck down these two conditions as unconstitutional because they are violative of Indian Constitution. But later what happened was, in an amendment, in a 2018 amendment, the legislature brought an amendment to 45 and they inserted the words under this act. Earlier it was under Part A, now it says under this act. But the question is whether these two provisions are revived or not. Okay, this is still a question. This question is still not answered because once a provision is declared unconstitutional, unless the parliament brings a new law into this place and revives that law won't be operated. Okay. Parliament here, what they did was they simply inserted the words under this act instead of Part A. So this was later challenged in the case of Upendra Rai versus Directorate of Enforcement, where this particular aspect was taken into consideration. The Delhi High Court said, look, substitution of phrase punishable for a term of imprisonment for more than 3 years under Part A of schedule with under this act does not resurrect the twin condition listed under section 45(1), which were struck down by the Supreme Court in 2017. Therefore, for deciding bail applications under PMLA, only considerations are prima facie material available to fortify the commission of the offence, gravity of the offence, severity of the punishment, etc. So here the Delhi High Court said the twin conditions that are imposed under 45A are no more in existence. You need to go back to the conditions that are given under the CRPC. You need to follow CRPC when it comes to bail. This was again followed in P. Chidambaram versus Directorate of Enforcement Directorate in the before the Supreme Court. Even Supreme Court has taken a view that as far as bail is concerned, bail under PMLA is concerned, you need to go by the principles of CRPC and not by the twin conditions that is imposed here. Now, coming to the last aspect of today's case, this is about section 17 and section 50 of PMLA. Okay, section 17 talks about search and seizure, which is very similar to section 90 of CRPC. If you can, read these two provisions together, you can find some similarities. Here, and seizure can be conducted by the director or any other officer not below the rank of deputy director if they have reasons to believe. What happened was in fact, there is one case that we recently got involved with. In that case, what happened? A person's property was raided. This person was not accused in FIR or ECIR. The main allegation was against the company and the directors. Since this person was working as an employee in that company, even this property was raided. During the raid, the enforcement directorate did not find anything incriminating. But what they did was they proceeded to recording various statements. Statements like his bank account details, his Aadhaar number, his PAN card details, his email account ID, his email ID, password, everything. Everything was taken from him. But then this matter came to us. Then we pointed out under section 17(1)(f), when a search is conducted, the ED officer only gets a power to record a statement when there is something incriminating that is found from the search. If there is no incriminating evidence, then this provision cannot be used to record any statement. But here in this case, the ED officer used this 17(1)(f) to record a statement when there was nothing incriminating that was obtained at all. So we challenged this before the adjudicating authority by saying, look, this ED officer has surpassed his power given under section 17(1)(f). Section 17(1)(f) says you can examine a person on oath and record his statements only when you find something incriminating during the search and seizure and not before that. But the adjudicating authority was not very forthcoming with this, was not very convinced. In fact, he had a very hands-off approach to say, all these are very technical position of law which you need to take before the writ court, and we are not appreciating it. But, you know, we are not going to stop there. We'll be challenging that order before the tribunal. This is one thing. Then coming to section 50 of PMLA. Ladies and gentlemen, section 50 talks about issuance of summon by ED authorities. Okay, it's like very similar to section 90 of PMLA, 90 of CRPC. In my limited experience in criminal practice, I've never come across a provision which is as draconian as section 50. In fact, there are some 4 problems to this provision. Okay, and I'll put that problems before you, and you decide whether this provision is draconian or not. When a ED authority issues section 50 notice to a person, okay, that person must attend. That person must attend, or a non-bailable warrant will be issued against him. This is the first problem. The second problem is, once a person receives a section 50 notice, he is compelled to answer any kind of questions that is put to him. Whether it's incriminating question or not, doesn't matter. He has to answer. So the constitutional protection of, Article 20 Clause 3, which deals with right against self-discrimination, that is gone. That is gone out of the window. So that's the second problem. The third problem is, if the person refuses to answer, then that person will be punishable under section 228 of CRPC, IPC, for refusing to answer, refusing to cooperate. And if at all that person answers, any statement that will be used against that, given by that person, will be used against him in the criminal trial. So it's like, once that section 50 notice comes into a person's hand, there are 4 problems that the person has to anticipate. It's like damned if you do, doomed if you don't. It's like entering into a battlefield with no way out. Once a section 50 notice comes to a person's, he receives a section 50 notice, then rest assured, ladies and gentlemen, that person's life can be made very miserable. So this is one thing. And this is coming to my last issue that I want to discuss. This is an issue about supplementary complaints that are filed by ED officers these days. See, in CRPC, there are provisions for filing supplementary charge sheet. If you take section 173, it says police officer can conduct something called further investigation. After conducting the further investigation, he can submit a supplementary charge sheet. That power is given to police officer. But you can't find any provision relating to supplementary complaints. There is no provision under PMLA. There is no provision under CRPC. But ED authorities these days are filing something called supplementary complaint without any, backing of law. This, it was very prevalent in the Augusta Westland case, where ED authorities filed complaints after complaint. There were 3 to 4 rounds of complaints that were filed by the ED authorities. But the problem is, this concept of supplementary complaint is foreign to criminal law. It was never heard before. And this can be challenged anytime now before the courts. Once it is challenged, the ED authorities will have a very difficult time to show what is the legal provision that backs them up to file all these supplementary complaints. So with this, ladies and gentlemen, I conclude today's presentation. I understand PMLA is a very technical legislation, but if you can understand Section 3 and what proceeds of crime are, then you can at least understand the conceptual clarity. You'll get a conceptual clarity of how PMLA functions. Okay, with this, I'll conclude today's presentation. If there is any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer.